everyone for coming this evening, and thank you very much to Hélène and the Alliance Française for hosting us. Merci à tous d'être venus. The presentation will be in English, but but for the question and answer session, I'd be happy to take questions in either English or French. So, après la présentation, si vous voulez poser des questions en français, on peut le faire aussi, ou en anglais. Okay, so I'll get started. I'll let you know that I've tried to keep the presentation fairly compact and as brief as possible. So I'll aim to speak for not more than 30 minutes. So I'll aim to speak for not more than 30 minutes, and then we can have more time for questions and answers. So we can make it a bit more interactive and engaging. So the topic this evening for this presentation is France in Europe in 1918. I thought, since it's a 100-year anniversary of World War I, it would be an interesting topic. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to aim to provide you with an overview, with a big picture overview of what was happening in France and in Europe in 1918. Now the focus is going to be on France and how events elsewhere in Europe impacted France. So, so that's going. So the focus will be France, but there will be a broad overview of what was happening in Europe in that year. Okay, so yes, this is the outline with these 5 points, and actually this presentation has there's 10 slides. So I'm going to aim to keep the presentation to within 30 minutes. First, just a very broad view of France's role and situation, military trends in 1918, toward the end of World War I, what was happening elsewhere in Central and Eastern Europe, and how those events impacted France. Okay, so I thought I'd get started with some broad statistics on France, on what France went through, and you can see there that the numbers are pretty staggering in terms of the human suffering that France endured, the level of mobilization of society, and also how all the suffering in the war, how that impacted the civilian population as well. So, of course, the soldiers, people in the army went through a lot of suffering, and we can see here some of the figures for the statistics for the casualties. But that also created an impact on the civilian population in terms of orphans, widows, and also the material costs, financial costs of all that. Yes, really staggering, sad numbers that give us an idea of what France had gone through in 4 years of war. So this slide provides a summary of France's internal situation, and we can see there some of the key points that I thought would be noteworthy for you. Many parts of France were actually occupied by the Germans, and so many French people spent a large part of the war under German occupation and under very difficult circumstances. France also had to experience all those large casualties, rationing, taxation. The role of women throughout the war also changed. That also happened, of course, in other countries. Now, just for a moment, I'll mention this, that in 1918, of course, the war started in France. Germany had declared war on France in early August of 1914. So by 1918, the war had been going on by the start of 1918, the war had been going on for almost 4 years. And throughout those 4 years, morale, of course, changed to some extent. with the ups and downs of the conduct of the war and successes and failures in military campaigns. And so in 1917, for example, there were large-scale mutinies in the French army due to soldiers' discontent and unhappiness with living conditions, with how army leadership was managing the war. So there, there was a lot of ups and downs in terms of morale, both within the army and the civilian population. Civilian population had to endure, of course, economic difficulties, social dislocation. Now, what's interesting is that in France there was some politicians, some sectors of the public were willing to consider a negotiated peace with Germany. One of the more prominent leaders of that group was Joseph Caillaux. He had been a minister of finance. But in any case, at the end of 1917, Georges Clemenceau became the prime minister, and so he was determined to bring the war to a successful conclusion, to win the war. So his famous quotes were "Ma politique intérieure, j'ai fait la guerre; ma politique étrangère, j'ai fait la guerre." So he was determined to win the war. He was determined that France would not negotiate a peace, what he saw as a dishonorable peace with Germany, and wanted to ensure France was victorious. So he came to power in December 1917, and he was prime minister throughout 1918 in France. And so the bottom line then, in terms of France's internal situation, is that in spite of the difficulties, in spite of the economic hardships, the casualties, the suffering, the doubts among some people as to whether the war could be won or not, the fact is that at the end of 1917, the President of the Republic, Raymond Poincaré, asked Georges Clemenceau, who was known to be someone who wanted to win the war, asked Clemenceau to become Prime Minister in late 1917. And so throughout 1918, Clemenceau provided a driving force to ensure that France would win the war. And he was a very strong personality. So some people who were thinking of a negotiated peace, such as Caillaux, were actually prosecuted, put in jail for a while. So in spite of all the difficulties, the challenges, Clemenceau and the French government in 1918 were determined to win the war. So they had, in that sense, they had a very clear goal, in spite of the challenges. And in terms of civilian morale, also went through trends and different ups and downs and changes. Now, in 1918, at the beginning of 1918, in March, the Germans started a big offensive in northeast France. So in early 1918, the Germans were hoping to win the war themselves. They had already knocked Russia out of the war, and so the Germans were starting a final offensive, Operation Michael, in March 1918, and they were hoping that would win the war for them. Now that was beaten back in the summer of 1918, and in the fall, the Allies started to push the Germans back toward Germany, and of course in November it was clear that the Allies were going to defeat Germany. So that also, when the military situation in France improved, that also had, of course, a positive impact on civilian morale and morale in the army. Just a map here just to show you how the Germans. So Belgium was occupied by the Germans throughout most of World War I, and many large sections of the French Northeast were also occupied at one time or another by the Germans. So this slide focuses on the military situation in 1918. So of course it was a key year in terms of military events. So Now, 1918 started when 1918 started, the Allies were in a very bad situation. Partly because in 1917, Russia, in early 1918, Russia dropped out of World War I. So Russia had started World War I as an ally of the United Kingdom and France, but with the February and the October revolutions in 1917 in Russia, that ensured that Russia would be knocked out of the war, and in March of 1918, the new Soviet government signed a peace treaty with Germany. So that meant that in early 1918, Germany was actually able to transfer large numbers of troops from the Eastern Front to the Western Front. And the Germans hoped that would enable them that those larger troop numbers in the Western Front would finally enable them to defeat the Allies on the Western Front. So that was very worrisome. The fact that Russia dropped out of the war was a very worrisome development for the Allies, and of course, conversely, a hopeful development for the Germans. So the Germans launched offensives in the Western Front starting in March, but also throughout the spring and early summer. Because the situation was so worrisome for the Allies, they finally decided to appoint one single Allied supreme commander, who would be and they chose a French general, Ferdinand Foch. They chose him to be the supreme Allied commander to coordinate operations by Americans, French, British armies. The Americans were starting to arrive at the Western Front, which was also a very hopeful development for the Allies. So finally, the British and the French have been fighting for 4 years. They're very exhausted. They've exhausted their financial, material resources. They've suffered many casualties, but Americans start to finally arrive in large numbers in the Western Front in early 1918, and so that's a very morale-boosting event for the French and the British. The tide starts to turn in July, August, and then the German armies collapse in September, October, and their allies, and then an armistice is finally signed on November 11th, where the Germans essentially surrender and accept defeat in the Western Front in World War I. And so this slide provides you with an overall view of what's happening throughout Europe. In gray, you can see there the Central Powers, so Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, the Ottoman Empire. Those four powers were all allied, and then the Entente powers were the United States, France, Italy joined later on, Serbia, Romania, and Russia. So in the Western Front, yes, the Germans occupied Belgium at the start of the war and some parts of northeast France. And so they kept those positions until pretty much the end of until the end of 1918. In the Eastern Front, we can see how Germany and Austria-Hungary ended up actually occupying large chunks of Belarusia and Ukraine and Western Russia. And so in 1918, the Germans and Austro-Hungarians were actually seen to have reached a positive end for them in the Eastern Front. They seem to have reached a successful conclusion for them. In March 1918, yes, I mentioned that the new Soviet government, led by Lenin, was already in control in Moscow and starting to consolidate itself. And so they signed a treaty where they agreed to give up to Germany and Austria-Hungary large chunks of what had been the old Russian Empire in Europe. And so that Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918 allowed Germany to shift large numbers of its troops from the Eastern Front to the Western Front to try to finish the war successfully for them on the Western Front as well. these are some of the events that were happening, some of the key events happening in Eastern and Central Europe. So yes, we just mentioned how the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was essentially a German victory. So with that treaty, the Soviet Union basically accepted the fact that Germany had defeated Russia and was willing to. So Lenin, in partly to consolidate the power of the power of the Communist Party and the Bolsheviks in Russia, Lenin was willing to sign a treaty with the Germans that would give up to them large chunks of what had been Western parts of the Russian Empire. And so that was signed in March 1918. Of course, Lenin would still have to fight the White Russian forces in the Russian Civil War for another 2 or 3 years. But at least in terms of the conflict between Russia and Germany, that ended through the Brest-Litovsk Treaty. Russian Civil War continued, and from a French standpoint, one interesting thing to keep in mind is that the French government and also French private investors had invested large amounts of money in Russian securities and Russian bonds prior to World War I. And partly because the French government wanted to help support the Tsarist regime, and so encourage that investment. Now, when the communists came to power, they repudiated all those commitments to pay back French loans and to pay back interest or coupons on French bonds. And I found a New York Times article from November of 2000, saying that finally the Russian and French governments had reached an agreement 82 years later to pay back a portion of those French loans and investments. So Lenin and Trotsky repudiated those commitments, but the Russian government later on agreed to pay back a portion of that to the heirs of the original French investors. So the Central Powers started to collapse in October, November. So Bulgaria, Turkey, Austria-Hungary, Germany's allies start surrendering. Austria-Hungary was dissolved, and Germany also entered a chaotic domestic period. So Eastern Europe went through a large number of changes. Yes, and let me now speak about the impact of those changes and those events on France. So we mentioned how with the fall of Tsarist Russia, France lost a key ally. So before World War I, France had been allied with Tsarist Russia. Both Russia and France collaborated with each other to provide counterbalances to the German Empire. So they were allies. Now, when the revolutions in 1917 toppled the Tsarist regime, and then later the provisional government, and the Bolsheviks came to power, France lost a major ally in Eastern Europe, and so of course France lost its financial investments, but more than that, yes, France lost a strategic ally, and France and Russia had been allied had a formal treaty of alliance since 1896, and so they've been allies for quite a while. And the breakup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire also created many changes in Southeast Europe, and of course the defeat of the Ottoman Empire and the eventual dissolution of the Ottoman Empire also brought changes, and so France had to also deal with a very fluid situation in Southeast Europe. France still had colonies and financial interests in the Mediterranean, in the Eastern Mediterranean. France had colonies in Syria and elsewhere, and so France had to adapt to that new situation in Southeast Europe as well. The defeat in 1918 of Germany, of course, meant that Germany would have to give back Alsace and Lorraine to France, and also give up certain of its territories in East Prussia to the New Poland, and pay reparations to the Allies. And so that brought that brought humiliation and resentment to many Germans. And so France had to deal with, in the 20s and the 30s, with the fact that many Germans wanted revenge and were angry with the settlement, and were looking for ways to change the World War I peace treaties at Versailles and elsewhere. So France had to deal with that situation, with a resentful Germany, so France did get back Alsace and Lorraine, but it had to then deal with a neighbor who was very unhappy with the result of the war, and of course unhappy with the fact that it had to also pay reparations, what it was expected to pay reparations payments to France and other allies. Now, the United Kingdom and the USA, of course, had been allied with France during the war, and in many ways they had collaborated effectively. Now, one of the reasons, of course, that they've been allied is that Germany had been a common enemy. Now, once Germany was defeated, the differences in perspective between France and the UK and the United States started to manifest themselves more openly. So, for example, many French leaders wanted to take a more punitive approach toward Germany, but many British leaders and many American leaders were opposed to that, and so there was some friction over that. So, when you're in the war, you're both facing the common enemies, and so it's relatively easy to get along, relatively easy to work together for the final goal. But once the enemy is defeated, then your differences and your suspicions start to come out into the open. And France and the United Kingdom also had, before the war, had quite a bit of rivalry in terms of colonies and colonial expansion. And of course, the USA, President Wilson and other American leaders had quite a different perspective on European issues and colonial issues than many Europeans. France, of course, the end of the war, the whole war and the end of the war brought a great deal of exhaustion and social and economic trauma to France. France, before the war, the population had been about 41 million in France, but with the casualties of war and the much lower birth rate, after the war, France's population dropped to about 38 million or so. So there's huge demographic impact, which was not only going to be felt right after the war, but was also going to be felt one generation or even two generations after the war. So France, by the end of 1918, France has to make these choices about what is it going to do with its own empire, with its own colonies. What is going to be France's approach toward the new German Republic? What is France's approach going to be toward the Soviet Union? So those were all important questions that the French leaders and French society had to address. And in many ways, they did not address them very successfully in the 20s and 30s. This is a map of what Europe looked like right after 1918. So Germany is a bit smaller because France took back Alsace and Lorraine, and parts of Eastern Prussia went over to were transferred to the new Polish state. The Austro-Hungarian Empire has completely broken up, and in its place we see new smaller states: Czechoslovakia, Austria, Hungary, Yugoslavia, and the Soviet Union. In 1919, it was still not absolutely clear that the Soviet Union would survive, because there was a civil war going on in Russia between the Reds and the Whites, which would go on until about 1921. But officially, the new Poland had already been created, and the Soviets the communist government would, of course, eventually defeat the white forces in Russia, in Russia, and establish itself as the Soviet Union. In 1918, the Allies had sent some small numbers of troops and some supplies to support white Russian forces, and to make sure that certain military supplies that the Allies had provided to the previous Russian governments, did not fall into the hands of the Bolsheviks. So there was some limited and not very effective Allied intervention in the Russian Civil War in 1918. France did contribute some troops, but not many. So France's main efforts in World War I were on the Western Front, and also providing support also to Italy, and also providing troops in northern Greece to fight against Bulgaria. Okay, so now those were the slides that I was hoping to go through with you. Now, I thought I would try something new to try to make make the lecture a bit more interactive and also ask you to participate. And can I ask does everybody have their phone, their iPhone or text phone here? So I'd like to try something. It's totally optional, but I have prepared some questions for you regarding the topic this evening, and you can. This is a website called Poll Everywhere. You can text your answer. It's used sometimes for university courses to give students a chance to respond.